Even the most subtle colors can take your breath away when they are emphasized in exactly the right way. Hi there, my name is Colby Bloom, and it is day 5 of Painting the Wilderness World of Color. And today we are mostly going to be painting nothing at all. I mean, obviously we're painting a scene, but what I'm saying is we're using a lot of white space or light space to emphasize just a few subtle color shifts in the sky and adding some dark contrast on top of that to show how you don't need to use heaps and heaps of vibrant colors to get a breathtaking colorway. You really don't. You can use a few layers of delicate pale hues and a lot of white space, and it will really glow. So this is Arctic Prism, and I hope you enjoy. This one is super fun because the premise is fairly simple, right? We're painting really delicate colors in the sky and then really contrasting them against dark, dark trees to bring movement and brighten them up. And all together, painting this in real time, including doing the loved and learned exercise, which typically takes me 5 to 7 minutes, something like that. This video took me 37 minutes in real time, and so it was pretty quick to do it all together. And I'm really excited to do it with you. So I'm prepping my scene with binder clips and tape. I'm getting it wet with clean water, and I'm going to use some gray paint. Gray meaning mixing a bunch of colors together. So the thing about gray especially is you can make it with pretty much anything. I am making it with some blue. So I think I have some cerulean and some galaxy black in there. This almost looks a little violet too. So, whatever is on my palette, that's kind of what I'm mixing together to create this gray mix. But then I'm using tons of water because I don't want my sky to look gray. I want it to look hazy, right? I want it to look white, like it's filled with white gray clouds, like a wall of white gray clouds. So that's the kind of the effect, the color that I'm going for. And I'm painting it from the top about halfway down, and then from the bottom also a little bit upward. But I want to leave that center strip white because that is where my colors are going to go. So while this is still wet, it hasn't dried since I painted the gray. While this is still wet, I'm going to take my size 6 brush and use some fairly watery but also pigmented Quinacridone Gold and just paint a strip all the way across the center. And then I'm going to use my brush to blend up and to blend down. And then I'm going to take some Quinacridone Rose and paint underneath. I think I also put some Scarlet Lake in there so it's a bit more red, but we're basically just laying down color, blending, laying down color, blending. You can blend either with whatever's on your brush, or you can wash and blend with water. The more water you blend with, the more washed out the colors are going to get. So I put down Quinacridone Gold, Quinacridone Rose, Scarlet Lake, then Rose of Ultramarine, that's that violet strip under there, and then a little bit of cerulean under Rose of Ultramarine. So you don't have to use all these very specific colors. Really what we're trying to do is get like a blue, like a prism, right? A prism of a rainbow prism where blue, like violet, blue, red, yellow, and not exactly the color that it's supposed to go, but you get the picture. So I think I added some Phthalo Turquoise under there also, just all these different colors that I have, adding strips, blending with water, adding strips, blending with water. And the more water I use, again, the more washed out my color is going to be, but that's okay. I just want it to look fairly blended. I want it to look like all the colors are kind of melting into each other. And it doesn't have to be vibrant. In fact, I don't want it to be really super vibrant, right? I still want it to be relatively delicate, to be relatively washed out, because that's what's going to make it look like it's glowing behind this wall of trees that we're going to paint. So I let that layer dry. Now I took some very, very light value cerulean And I'm just kind of giving myself a little outline for where I want these trees to be. So, like a mountain outline, basically, on the left side, and then kind of sloping downward. And then I'm using what's left over on my palette and on my brush to kind of add a little bit of shadow. Because the way to paint snow, if you're wondering how to paint snow, is to paint around the snow. It's to paint the shadows in the snow, not the snow itself. I mean, you can paint the snow itself, which we're going to do with white gouache toward the end of this tutorial, but if you want to paint snow purely with watercolor, the traditional way where you're using white space, it's to use very, very light value shadowy paint to paint the shadows around and in the snow. So I painted that snowbank, and now I'm going to use my DIY foliage brush to paint a wall of trees. So basically what I'm doing here is, instead of painting pine trees using the blobby technique that I often use, I'm using the foliage brush to give the impression of pine trees, and then I'm going to add details like trunks later. So I'm painting this wall of pine trees, and it's sloping down, and the pine trees are gradually getting smaller and smaller. And then I'm going to take this is Payne's Gray, by the way. The trees are Payne's Gray. Like a very, very dark value Payne's Gray. And then I'm going to take my size 2 brush and kind of fill in the gaps, add the details so that these actually do look like evergreen trees. Basically, the reason I did the foliage brush and then adding the details after is it just doesn't take as long. It shortens the process, and it makes it so that I don't have to worry about being random. I don't have to worry about if I'm like getting the texture right, because I can let the foliage brush do the work and then I can add the details later. I am all about leaning into making a mess and then adding the details later. So I added the trunks, and then on the trunks that look just a little too bare at the top, I'm going back in and adding a few blobs. And I want like the bottoms of these evergreen trees to look more full, so more like a block of color. And then as they get toward the top, to have more flecks of dry space in between. And then as we move down the slope, I want the trees to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's to create depth. Because when we don't use value, we can use size to create depth. Larger means it's closer, it's in the foreground. Smaller means it's farther away, it's in the background. And so using size and using like having the trees be sparser and sparser is one way that we are tricking our eyes into thinking, oh, this scene goes into, right? We're seeing into this valley, we're seeing into this scene as opposed to just straight across. So I'm using my small brush to add tiny, tiny clusters of trees and making them, some of them even just, very, very small. Then, in order to add even more depth, I'm going to add a faraway hill. This is something I could have done first, and maybe it's more comfortable for you to paint the faraway hill first and then paint the foreground trees. But it's pretty easy to add afterward if you're like me. So I'm using a lighter value Payne's Gray, not too much lighter. You can still definitely see it, but I'm painting these tiny, tiny little blobs of trees, basically just the tiny lines and then lines across, like vertical lines and then horizontal lines across those vertical lines to make it look like this hill, right? There's a tiny distant hill that has these trees kind of zigzagging up and down the hill. That's the effect that we're going for. And then I'm going to use a very light value cerulean to try to kind of like paint the shadows on this hill in the distance. But I don't need to paint very much. I almost want those trees to look like they're disappearing. And that's kind of the effect that we're going for. So again, we're not looking for perfection for those tiny trees. We're looking at tiny little blobs, and that's okay. So now I'm taking my size 2 brush, adding some cerulean shadows, definitely adding blue shadows to snow. Kind of makes it come more alive. I'm adding some Galaxy Black and some Payne's Gray shadows, but I don't want to add too many shadows to this sunny, to this sunny, snowy spot because I still want it to look relatively white. So now I'm gonna add snow to the trees. And the trick with adding gouache snow to trees, this is white gouache, it's Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed proof white, is that you want to leave behind pockets of that dark space, right? You're not just like painting white all across. I'm just painting strips of white so that I can kind of, see where the tree is and where the snow is. I'm generally painting snow on top of the branches. But if it's easier for you to just think like, I'm just gonna paint randomly and intentionally leave behind pockets of dark space, right, of that paint, that works too. So we're just trying to paint in little kind of blobby, horizontal, really random lines of white gouache. And the further down the line we get, the fewer we're going to paint, right? The less snow we're going to see because it's so far away that we can't really see it. So the most snow is going to be on the foreground trees on the left, and then as we get down to the right, we're going to paint not very much snow at all. Finally, I'm going to add some little flecks of grass, some like Payne's gray little pockets of grass. Toward the bottom, the grass would be bigger. Toward the trees, the grass would almost just look like little dots. That's just to add a little bit of texture. And there we go. I added my signature because we are all real artists, right? And I just have to tell you, I really, really loved this one. I think it's pretty simple. I think that there are some things that could trip you up. Like I think that the gradient might feel a little bit tricky in order to get all three colors in there, but that's okay. Even if you only get two colors, even if it looks kind of muddy and you have to try again, not a big deal. If you don't do that background hill with the trees, I totally get it. That one is kind of tricky, but all of these elements, all of that white space comes together to really contrast against the prism of colors, and I think it's such a fun way to do that. So, loved and learned. I loved the subtle gradient. I also loved the disappearing trees. I always love painting shadows on snow, and the foliage brush, it just comes in handy so, so much. I learned that maybe I wanted to do that background hill first. Maybe that would have felt a little less awkward, like, trying to paint something in the background last minute. Was the grass really necessary? I don't know. Something also important for you to know is if you didn't want to use gouache for the snow on the trees, you could also have used masking fluid and applied masking fluid ahead of time and then painted the trees on top of the masking fluid and then removed the masking fluid. But masking fluid can be a real pain, especially if you're just a beginner. So that's a big part of the reason why I didn't use it. I usually recommend that beginners use white gouache just so you can get a hang of where you want the snow to be before you have to, because with masking fluid, you really kind of have to know where it's supposed to go before you've even painted the thing, right? So I had such a fun time painting this one. And again, I want to emphasize, you don't need to paint overcomplicated paintings in order to have a good time. You don't need to make the color the whole scene. You can use neutrals, a lot of neutrals, to accentuate the color, and it can still glow off the page. That's one of the really cool things about landscapes. It's the really cool things about composition and color theory is sometimes simple really is just stunning. So thank you.